All right, and we're live.
All right. There.
Hey, Megan,
Okay.
it's all over to you.
All right. Thank you. And I'm sorry for my tardiness. So, Maria, thanks for pulling that up. Can you go ahead and just pull us up to the, oh, you're at the most recent item. So, all right. Dig on in.
Starting on improved wastewater energy efficiency.
Yep.
Okay. So the idea with this one is to try to enhance the emission reduction strategies that can be deployed at wastewater sites. Generally, this is through energy efficiency improvements. There's a lot of opportunities there. They mirror other opportunities that you find in the industrial sector. So this will be things like process improvement, cascading heat capture, electrification. Those are all things that can help typically on-site operations improve. You also have the fact that wastewater facilities are generally high quality candidates for combined heat and power that can be fueled by the methane produced on-site with anaerobic digesters, which makes them kind of unique as an actual renewable source of natural gas that can be used to provide electricity and high heating levels that are required as a part of the water treatment process. So there's also the last thing to flag there is that wastewater plants tend to be on a lot of acreage in many circumstances, which can make them also good candidates for solar installations. That would be the bulk of what I would say on that one. Are there questions to help with?
Matt, what's the
which is that Athens is currently undergoing several energy audits at water treatment plants now, and the report should be completed later this year.
what's the typical footprint of a combined heat and power plant and anaerobic digester for a wastewater treatment plant?
So both of those will be scaled to the size of the plant. So they're customized in each circumstance.
I think Athens has, we have 4 plants or 3 plants.
3. Let's see.
3.
Cedar. What they call the stinky plant on Bailey Street.
I mean, I don't know. I'm guessing like if they're evenly sort of divided between our water usage, we use maybe, I could be totally wrong here, 15 million gallons of water a day in Athens. So maybe a third of that. I don't, like, how big is that plant? Do we have any idea? I'm just wondering, like, is it something that was going to compete with solar on the site, where you're going to be an either or is it something that is doable to have both?
So real quick to answer your question, Michael, North Oconee River Reclamation Facility is on Bailey Street or north so it's over that way near campus, College Station Road area. That's the smallest site, so there's not a lot of capacity there unless there was some kind of cooperative arrangement with UGA and their parking lot, because that used to be part of the property, and that park and ride area out there was in a land swap with UGA. So it'd have to go to some kind of a parking lot array to access that, which currently is not legal in Georgia to have that situation, as you know, from the PSC regulations. Middle Oconee is off Will Hunter Road. That one's a little bit bigger. I don't know how many acres, but I have been out there, and there is space out there for some degree of an array. And then Cedar Creek Water Reclamation is 450 acres, and it's got plenty of room, although the topography is not the best in that location. So those, I think, certainly middle and Cedar would be open to the potential for arrays. And we got one. We already have one at Cedar Creek, and it was on an old, former building site footprint, so we didn't even have to disturb forest to get there.
I was just going to add that in general, um, the anaerobic digesters in the CHP can be added without taking a lot of additional square footage on site. The review that Megan pointed at will better detail what the financial opportunities are. In general, in Georgia, if we're looking at a wastewater plant that is being built by a co-op or a municipal utility, the financial opportunity is strong in these applications because they tend to be billed as commercial operations. If they're Georgia Power customers, then they tend to be on an industrial rate that's significantly lower. So the return is either slower or can be wiped out financially just by having that much lower rate. But I think the results that we're going to get back here soon should let us know what the circumstances are at those wastewater plants.
One quick question for you, Matt. You see like Georgia Tech has some on-site wastewater treatment where they're hitting it at a smaller level. That's pretty cutting edge technology that does require expertise. Is there any relevancy in trying to include something here for that type of installation, or is that just still too far out there to be cost effective?
Emory probably has the most cutting edge one that I've seen deployed right now for their campus. And there might be like a UGA application of a similar installation. The main thing that they use to make that financially viable for them is the reduction in sewer rates and sewer bills that they have to pay as a part of it, which is probably you're a little too far downstream by the time it gets to the plant for that to be a major benefit. But there may be kind of upstream applications of that kind of technology that could be helpful.
Thank you.
Megan, what's next for us here?
Oh, sorry, I've been speaking, and I guess no one heard me. I was saying this seems like a good opportunity to fold in wastewater CHP, and I was going to just flag that I understand from George Buchanan, who's doing the audits of those sites, that has already been ruled out at North Oconee as cost prohibitive.
Yeah, I think I just said pretty much everything I would have said about expanding wastewater CHP. So we may get our time back on that one.
All right, then what about reduced urban heat island effects?
So in that case, we're primarily looking at efforts to increase the reflectivity. The technical science term is albedo of impervious surfaces and tree coverage, and then also to address social stresses that are induced by urban heat island issues. So if you're not familiar with this as a concept, urban heat island is a phenomenon where you have urbanized areas that capture more heat than the surrounding areas. That's generally due to having things like more asphalt, darker surfaces, less reflectivity happen, so more of the heat is trapped locally. So you get a higher temperature as a result. That can lead to higher health risks and a whole bunch of other issues that are related to elevated heat exposures. So things like higher energy bills as well. Urban heat islands normally caused by geography. Solutions include deploying reflective surfaces. This can be things like simple things like white roofs or planting more trees. And it can also be things that get significantly more exotic. So having reflective street applications, there's special kinds of asphalt, for example, that will, that's not like they're white, but they're coated in a way that will reflect the sun's rays back up instead of trapping some of that more on the ground level. All of that will help with the albedo issues. And then the trees have the added benefits of inducing cooling just through their breathing process. The evapotranspiration releases water into the air, and that can also help cool things down. Challenges for this can be the attention that's required just to get it up off of the ground and the knowledge base. White roofs do qualify for incentives. So there have been federal incentives historically. There may be new ones coming down depending on what happens with the infrastructure bill. That's certainly a live part of the conversation in Washington right now. And historically, there's also been utility incentives for white roofs. They're typically not any more expensive than alternatives today, but they lag in adoption. And in part, that's just people don't know that this is a cost-effective opportunity for them. Other efforts, so things like the reflective surfaces on streets and sidewalks, do tend to come with a higher price tag. So it's a kind of a funding question at that point. Green space solutions, you may encounter funding and some land use barriers that slow the adoption in those cases.
Matt, how complex is it to identify areas that are suffering from being hotter than other areas in town? Like, is that a complicated process to get that information? Yes, it is.
It is very complicated.
Okay.
We've got a new staff member joining our team on Thursday who just finished her master's, and her whole master's thesis was developing new machine learning algorithms to figure out urban heat island data. Like, it's a very complex data problem to solve. That said, I'm really optimistic we're about to have that information because I'm planning on giving that to her as a job to figure that out. But yeah, it's not simple, and there's a lot of effort kind of going into trying to figure it out right now in academic institutions nationally.
I do have a research that was done on the effect of tree canopy in urban environments, and the tipping point, according to the research, is approximately 40% coverage. That if you could achieve full canopy coverage over about 40% of a city block, you effectively will trip the cooling effect that you experience in a forest. So you begin to see those cooling effects move outward beyond just to the area that doesn't have the tree canopy. But there seems to be, I mean, that in the research, it also covers things like roofs and things. So if you got buildings sticking above your canopy, you can achieve it down below the canopy, but you don't achieve it above the canopy. So that continues to radiate and affect that benefit, if that makes sense. I can share that with folks if you're interested.
All right, now we're going to switch gears pun intended, to transportation items. And yeah, get started on here. So the first item is public transit investments to expand service and increase passenger miles traveled.
The description of this one's pretty straightforward, I think. You're just looking basically to improve the experience that people have using the transit system by making it operate faster, more reliably, and then there's some small things you can do to make the experience itself overall better. So those may be security related, they may be things like you're seeing the rollout widely of things like Wi-Fi on transit vehicles. Those kinds of things can help make the experience itself better. Nationally, this is now kind of regarded as a foundational transportation climate policy, trying to bring more people to use transit options through improving the experience. The effects have varied by community. I'm sure you're surprised to know. But our review here has shown a mid-range estimate of about a 10%, where a 10% improvement in the frequency from the transit system produces a 5% increase in ridership. So to put that another way, if you had, I don't know, I'm going to use round numbers that aren't going to be perfectly correct here, but if you had a bus that was showing up every 10 minutes and then now you had a bus that was arriving every 8 minutes, you'd see a corresponding increase in ridership there. The addition, there's also been some information that says the addition of an app or real-time data can also boost ridership by just under 2%. Big challenges for this are overcoming political inertia and acknowledging that current service levels may not be ideal. That's been difficult in many communities. And despite its position as foundational, few cities have successfully moved this policy forward without ballot initiatives backing it. So it has required a strong public vote of confidence to get it outside kind of internal and political bureaucratic hurdles in other cities. I can speak a little bit to some examples there if that's of interest.
Is there information on the relationship between cost and ridership, like in terms of the cost at the fare box?
I'm sure there is. I don't have it handy to speak to, but we could look for some of that if you want to dig in on that kind of a relationship.
In conversations with transit recently, they have been looking at expanding service through micro transit opportunities, which are essentially on-call buses that show up to sites, specific pickup locations based on a phone call from, and I would assume an app could also do something similar. Um, is there any influence on that type of service to ridership? In other words, the more that is happening, the more the greater the ridership? Or I don't know that you know that answer.
There is. It's kind of measured the same way, like you have a percent increase in availability or frequency is going to produce a percent increase in ridership. You see the particular kind that you were just mentioning, Mike, being especially effective with the disabled and senior populations.
Thank you.
Okay. Next item is commuter carpooling incentives.
So this one has kind of been one of my favorite transportation related policies for a long time. And then we've all just kind of been living with a forced version of it since COVID broke out. The idea with this one is to reduce commuting trips and shift commuting to transit or to higher occupancy vehicles through things like carpooling, using parking incentives and transit incentives. So the idea there is to basically make it more expensive to park if you're driving in a single occupancy vehicle, provide reduced cost transit passes, that kind of thing. In general, this has been studied heavily, and it's viewed as one of the more impactful climate policies that could be broadly deployed. So if we see a push more towards carpooling, we see a 5% reduction in vehicle miles traveled for a heavy emphasis on carpooling, and a 70% vehicle mile travel reduction for pushes on telecommuters. So if you can get your workforce to begin telecommuting, you have a strong, really strong reduction. Throughout COVID, we're now starting to get the first sets of transportation data in across the country, and we're seeing reductions in single occupancy vehicle transportation emissions up to between 20 and 30% for most cities in 2020, which I think in one way gives us direct evidence of how impactful telecommuting can be as a climate solution here. The challenges here is that government tends to be kind of the lead implementer, and they tend not to focus the programs in a useful way. So there's a lot of choices that go into outsourcing program enrollment and to targeting private sector employees instead of targeting the commuters themselves. So you'll see, a city put their hand up and say, we signed up 50 employers for our commuter program. And that doesn't really tell you if you're going to get 50 people or 5,000 people to use it. So those efforts need to be a little more explicitly targeted towards the people who are going to be using the programs, because otherwise your results are highly variable and almost unmeasurable, which makes it also then very unhelpful if you're trying to figure out, is this an effective program we should continue to operate? So my strong advice on that is to create targets that are established for the number of enrollees in the program, not the number of employers. They also do require financial outlays. I mean, this is a cost if you're going to try to provide an incentive for people to telecommute, or you're going to face some pushback if you're going to try to increase the cost of parking with employers. But also post-COVID, you are obviously seeing more employees trying to do more work from home or the hybrid office opportunities. So that may reduce some of the financial burden that historically would have been borne by government or public entities.
I think that everyone has been well educated in the benefits of telecommuting recently, but carpooling has always seemed to me like there's all these logistical issues and personal issues and the fact that people love being in their cars by the time, that make it this significant hurdle to get people to adopt it. And so, like, who's been successful in doing that? I mean, because there are tons of people that absolutely can't telecommute; their jobs don't allow that. And so I just wonder who's been successful in implementing a program where they've gotten people to, get 4 people in a car and go to work.
There are a few good examples where that's occurred. Vancouver in Canada has one of the more successful programs in that area as far as like long-term success goes. More recently, Austin, Texas, launched a commuter program a couple of years ago where they were able to get a little over 2,000 people enrolled before COVID struck, and now there were millions enrolled. So I think there's some recent successes we can draw on from other American cities there, but I think the results for us would largely say if we can do telecommuting successfully, that's the more effective climate policy regardless.
All right. Upzoning near transit stations and decreasing parking requirements.
Getting our wonk factor up to 10 here. So yeah, the effort here is to try to boost ridership per transit vehicle around affected transit stations through density. So the goal, you want to reduce the distance to transit stops
Matt,
for people that might use transit. Yes.
it might be helpful to define what you mean when you say density in this context.
Yeah. So this is residential density. So this is the number of people living per square mile in an area. So you'd be bringing together likely more apartments and condos, multifamily housing. Generally today you see that coupled with some commercial retail applications as well. So you'll get this kind of mixed use building stock that will be built in and around and focused around a transit location.
Quick question, Matt. Because there is in the industry some different numbers that are used. I've seen a quarter mile be considered walkable for transit purposes. And I think the feds use that a lot. I think that would be important to have a distance from a transit stop as a hard line. So would that distance be a quarter mile, or is there another standard we should use?
That is the regular go-to. So yeah, quarter mile is a good one. If you dig in more with the economists, they'll do fancy hedonic regressions that are going to let you break out, continuously as very like the further away you get, like you can still see the effects.
Yeah, it starts
quarter mile is
close
pretty
to
good.
it starts close to the epicenter and then falls off percentage wise as you move outward. It's not a straight line.
Absolutely. Yep. So the results, and so like in general, if you get all of this stuff pulled together, that's a core component of what's called a transit-oriented development. Those are shown to reduce vehicle miles traveled, to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips, increase ridership on transit vehicles. Additional benefits that come from that is it can also help with housing shortages and affordability issues. So a lot to like out of that, but it's not without its challenges. So if we increase density, you can also see pushback from existing residents in an area. A lot of times the way that you get more transit-oriented development is to decrease the parking requirements that come with new developments. That can reduce parking availability. That's kind of the idea. If the transit system is not able to easily accommodate the increased demand, then there's also a risk of user dissatisfaction. So the user experience could go down. And it may be less politically acceptable in less urbanized contexts. So all just kind of potential flags to have there.
Any thoughts on that one before we get on?
So I guess I have a question about applicability and a city the size of Athens with a transit system like we have. I mean, I've seen examples of this like in Northern Virginia and things like that, where they have the trains, and around the trains there's this huge buildup of development at the stops. But like what does that look like, say, in a town our size, where we have bus routes?
Yeah, I think that's a good flag that it's going to be less effective. I think your pushback is also likely to be a bit stronger. Probably the most successful thing would just be to try to have produce the incentives so that there were just fewer parking requirements, so that you would have an incentive to see more use of the bus system. But that's likely to be the best application.
Okay, behavioral nudging.
So this is pulling a playbook out of behavioral economics, which was super in vogue like 10 years ago for a bunch of this stuff. The idea would be to develop a program that can nudge the usage of transit. So some recent successful examples are like texting systems that can determine if a transit system is going to be faster than driving at a particular moment. There's a lot of programs that have been put out into the world to try to help people, or to drive people, to push people to use transit more frequently. Those are normally based on one of two things. It's either giving the time, so just saying, here's information about how the transit system's operating right now. This is how long it's going to take you to drive. Wouldn't it make more sense to use transit? Or you see cash rewards. So there's like lottery systems that are out there. You know, if you use the transit system, you get entered into potentially get a cash reward. Both of those have been effective and have induced about a 5% reduction in single occupancy vehicle trips in cases where you've seen significant buy-in from the commuting population. The major challenge for this is that it's normally driven by the adoption and use of technology like an app or a website. So attracting users to that platform, whichever, an app or the website, whichever way they're going to get to it. That's normally the biggest challenge, is actually getting people to use that technology. If you do go down a route where you're providing a cash incentive, then funding becomes another question.
All right, how about implementing high priority segments in the walking and biking network?
Goal here is to increase the amount of walking and biking infrastructure as another way to get people out of their cars. The research in this one has shown that improving these opportunities, so improving the bike ped opportunities, can increase the number of people using that infrastructure, not surprisingly. So to what Mike was mentioning before, you have walkability scores. So a 5% increase in a walkability score has been shown to reduce vehicle miles traveled by about 6.5%. A 1 mile expansion in bike lanes can induce a 0.1% increase in cycling commutes. So those are kind of the two major points I would keep in mind as typical experiences.
Say that one more time. 5% increase in walkability score increases.
I have these written down. I will drop them into the chat so that you don't need to try to guess.
That would be great. I mean, if that kind of information put added to that would be fantastic. Any of those kind of statistics as we go through, just to remind us of that, that becomes really helpful. We do have an Athens in Motion uh, plan, so um, I'm not familiar enough to know what their priority matrix is. I do know they have one. Is anybody on this WebEx who knows that? If not, we'll find out. Then that will help us as we move forward.
The one kind of flag I'd put on there is the 1 mile expansion in the bike lanes works. That's essentially good for, it'd be good for Athens. Like that kind of figures about right for what we'd expect with Athens. You do have some cities that have just gone real heavy into bike lane expansion. And as a result, you start to get declining returns on the amount of people that can be brought towards cycling. We were working with Albuquerque, and they were proposing thousands of miles of bike lane infrastructure being added. And if they had just applied this as like a simple factor to that analysis, they would have been more towards a Davis, California, heading towards Copenhagen level of cycling expectations, which we don't really think is reasonable. Major challenges here are that current rates of cycling as a major form of transportation can be so low that it can be difficult to take the results of the findings and believe that they're going to hold long term. And there's also variations in the quality of the infrastructure that's being added. So not all bike lanes are created equal. I think you've probably seen that if you've gone cycling. Is this a protected lane? Is this just a shared lane with vehicles? Those are all kind of different considerations. And then lastly, the investments that are required for this are going to be competing with other public works dollars. So you're going to have an internal debate over how to spend the money.
Matt, do you have any data on the difference between the different types of bike lanes, as in open bike lanes on a road versus a protected multi-purpose trail or multi-purpose trail?
There's some that's starting to come in. I'd say it's a little too early to make definitive statements there. I've seen some good data get collected in LA and Portland on this, but they're also LA and Portland. So like, how far do we want to generalize from their experience? Like, I have some concerns there.
I mean, logically, it would say that you would get more ridership, more bicycling in areas protected, as opposed to feeling confident riding 3 feet away from somebody going 50 miles an hour.
Yeah, I think directionally we're totally on the same path. It's just magnitude is the part that's the open question.
Matt, Michael entered a question in the chat that I think goes back to an earlier item that we didn't get into in quite as much detail, which is there any data showing the impact of just reducing parking minimums on overall VMT?
There is, and I think that's actually one of the other policy options that we'll talk about that has a more explicit focus just on that parking component. Yeah, I think it's the parking management one that's a bit down the list. But okay. Yes, there is some data
there. Okay. Then next up is increase new mobility options through items like bike shares, electric bikes.
So this is similar, and just again trying to get people out of their cars and to start walking, biking, doing something different. I don't think that there's really a big difference in the major findings or things to think about here. It's just from the last policy option, but we're really looking at what's the impact specifically from dockless scooters and e-bikes I know Athens has had some restrictions on the scooters in the past. I don't know where they stand right now. I just remember being in Athens with Andrew and him walking around collecting them, picking them up off of the sidewalk. So uh, y'all can let us know where that stands at the moment. We do have a couple of cities though that have shown some ability to reduce last mile issues with transit riders through things like e-bikes and scooters.
One of the other questions they're wrestling with in Athens is the allowing e-bikes onto multi-use pathways. Um, so do you allow a motorized vehicle on or do you have to change it or make exceptions, or is it a top speed thing? So there's a lot of there's still some discussion about that in Athens.
Yeah. All right. EV education and incentives.
So this
What kind
is
of
looking at, oh, go ahead.
what kind of local incentives do you see, Matt, that could be implemented?
So that's a challenge. People generally think that this is going to be easier to do than it has been, than the research has shown. Um, so there's um, a lot of like ride and drive events that governments have partnered with dealers to do as a way to try to get EV ridership higher. Most of the research that's looked deep into that, that's been published in some of the best journals, the best science journals, has really shown that the people who go to those were already going to buy an electric vehicle. There were very few people that were skeptics or that weren't thinking about it who were induced to buy an EV that came out of those kinds of efforts. So the cost that's required that's coming out of kind of the economics field is saying that government's going to spend between 2,000 and 30,000 per new EV driver that they actually get, and everybody else is free riding on the program expenditures. The education, yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off there. Do you have any information as well on local governments simply providing public access to EV charging and increasing EV vehicle uptake at all? That seems like probably to me at least, one of the most straightforward ways to increase uptake.
Yes, and I think that's another one that's a little lower on the list. The ubiquitous EV charging infrastructure one. We'll speak more to that directly. To the question though about like incentives, we do see some cities that are providing cash incentives that have been more successful there, but it's generally been done in cities that have a municipal utility where they can partner with their electric provider, who's also a municipal government institution there. So you have like Austin, to go back to them again, Austin, Texas has got a really great program there where Austin Energy, which is their municipal utility, has partnered with the rest of the city of Austin to provide EV incentives that they've now quantified have led to more than 5,000 new vehicle purchases. It's probably the best example I've seen nationally.
Is there any way to know whether those are people that were already leaning that direction anyway? So, I mean, it's kind of like, are you essentially just kind of tipping people over the edge when they stood on the edge of the cliff? You just kind of gave them a little nudge over as opposed to bringing somebody to the cliffside?
Right. That's where more of the debate is. So like LA did a similar kind of thing, and they also have their own municipal utility. So they're the largest municipal utility in the country. And they were the ones that they actually were able to separate that out. Who were the people that were, as you said, kind of on the edge of the cliff, and who were the people they had to bring. Uh, and the incentive level they were identifying that they would need to provide to get those really new people to it was about $18,000. Now part of that could come from the federal subsidy, because right now you still have up to, I think it's 7,500 in EV tax credits for a number of the manufacturers available. So it's not like the city had to come up with all of that to bring people along, but it was more expensive than you might think.
Do things like available parking spaces, more convenient parking spaces, do those work to help increase ridership?
It'll be right now. The research is actually more connected to what I think Jacob was asking about on the availability of charging infrastructure, and that being a good way to bring more electric vehicles into the market.
Okay, thank you.
I think we might have done a two birds and one stone item there in terms of also covering the market transformation programs. Would that be accurate, Matt, to say?
Yeah, I do have a couple more points noted for this one. But it's mostly just that there's been some more research findings in this to say if you do go down the route of incentivizing EVs, never incentivize high-end luxury battery electric vehicles. You know, the guy that was going to buy a Tesla was going to buy a Tesla. That is not a rebate worth providing out of government. And generally don't incentivize what they call short range electric vehicles either. So things that only have like a 40-mile range. You see fewer and fewer of those. Like the market's increasingly moving to 200 and 300-mile range vehicles. So that's becoming less and less of a concern anyway, just because they're not going to be the primary kind of vehicle sold. But the optimal incentive level that you want to have in order to drive consumer adoption is still a research gap, would be the nice way to put that.
Okay. Now, high frequency public transit network.
So this one's similar but slightly different from some of the prior options. You're looking to decrease the distance to a transit stop and increasing the transit vehicle miles or hours. Those are both well-established means to increase ridership. And then they're also paired with an observed effect of reducing vehicle miles traveled community-wide. That probably sounds more obvious than it would appear for a lot of the people that go deeper on this. So you guys are probably aware of like the number of studies that show if you add another lane to a highway, people just increase their overall amount of driving. So there's a short-term benefit to congestion, but long-term you just have more cars on the road. Like you don't end up winning anything. This one is showing that you do. So that's kind of the nice. Oh yeah, that's what you would expect to happen, and there's not some sort of rebound effect coming out of it that takes back all of the wins that you thought you got. Those relationships are especially strong in areas that are creating new transit service, as you'd expect. They're also really strong in university towns, so and in suburbs that have rail transit stations. So the full effects of these changes typically take between 1 to 3 years to be observed. Which would lead to the challenge. So the challenges for this can be expense, like you are putting more money in to make these changes to the transit network. And then there's also patience. So you do have to wait a little bit to see what the effect of those changes has been. Vehicle availability is kind of increasingly becoming a challenge too, depending on what transit vehicle you're trying to deploy. And that's mostly a veiled hint that EV buses are in really high demand and can be hard to get your hands on right now. Any other questions on
Okay.
that?
Just a quick update for everybody. We have several T-Splosh proposals moving through right now. One of them is coming up Thursday. It's called Electrify the Fleet. That is being pushed out of the Sustainability Office in concert with multiple departments, including Transit and Central Services with their fleet folks. So we're hoping to, if that project is accepted, we'll be looking at about 47 vehicles, about 11 buses that would fall into that category over the 5 year of the T-Splosh program. So, and there's apparently Transit has also added several electric vehicles to their projections when they're proposing. A lot of what you'll see in their proposals are electric vehicles and chargers. So the movement among transit is pretty strong to convert over to the full electric. So just letting people know to be watching those T-Splosh programs go through, and hopefully we'll get some movement there.
Right. The low emission zones, Matt, if you're still there.
Yeah, sorry, my battery was starting to die. So speaking of electric vehicles and need to charge, currently relocating. But the low emission zones, that's an effort to create areas where high emitting vehicles are restricted at certain times of day or potentially all the time. Um, so you've got, this is really kind of focused on like freight uh, or like commercial vehicles and trying to make sure that they're not clustering in specific areas. The zones can reduce pollution concentrations as well as spur the adoption of low emission or zero emission vehicles. So, if you had some highly polluting, let's say Amazon trucks running around delivering things and you converted those all to electric, uh, this kind of policy can be something that can accelerate that transition for those commercial fleets. The pollution effects tend to be relatively minor in what's been measured so far, generally kind of less than 5%. But vehicle conversions and the reduction in emissions from those highly polluting vehicles have been observed. Those have been more pronounced. So kind of the big thing that we see out of that is that you can start to produce some significant equity wins out of this if you do have particular areas that have been negatively impacted, communities that have been negatively impacted by things like particulate matter or NOx that are waste streams coming from those kinds of vehicles. Challenge-wise, it's political will. Freight and commercial fleets are going to oppose limitations to their movement within delivery areas, and that's exactly what's being targeted here. And I think somewhat reflective of that, the best examples we have on this kind of policy are international. Like London and Stockholm are really good case studies, which doesn't necessarily mean that we've got a lot of good American experience to call on here.
So Matt, just to make sure I understand, this would be a situation, for example, where if it was in Athens, we'd say downtown zone, you can only have EV vehicles in the downtown zone between certain hours of the day to reduce pollutants. That would be similar to what they did in London and Stockholm.
That's right. We're
Right.
cruising right through these today.
AV transportation, not as exciting as buildings. All right, so parking management and pricing, and I guess this is where you can get to the question about parking minimums too.
Yes. Yeah, so the idea is to increase parking fees in high congestion zones, so basically areas that have a lot of demand for parking in order to encourage ride sharing or public transportation use to those areas. Research in this area shown a reduction in trips of 0.2% for a 1% increase in parking fees. So the wonky term for that is the elasticity is a minus 2.2%. There's significant variation in the research. So it could be as down to 0.1%, it could be up to 0.3%. That variation depends on demographic, geographic, travel choice characteristics. Studies also showed a decline in employees driving cars to work. That was actually kind of more significant here. So that dropped from 72 to 53% in one of the major studies on this, which is a pretty significant reduction in auto use in comparison to other policies that have that same kind of objective, trying to reduce total trips. Challenge-wise, you're looking at pushback from commuters and also from retailers who are currently benefiting from free or subsidized parking today, or ones that believe that they benefit from those things.
Is there any data that's come in, Matt, that compares differential parking rates or parking opportunities for EV vehicles versus non-EV vehicles in pushing people more toward EVs?
I haven't seen one that asked the question that way. I've seen ones that ask half of that question in both, kind of on either side of it. Like, so what's the effect of trying to push down the parking availability, or what's the effect of trying to incentivize, kind of through carrots, the use of the electric vehicle, but not one that's looked at the combination of both of those. So I don't think we've got real world evidence yet that would say how those would mix together.
And there's also the challenge of who does that impact. So, seniors, low income, transformation is going to come a lot slower, be a lot more challenging, may not make it in the time frame. But so if we have a preferential for EV parking in the best spots, that in a way also hits populations that have the least ability to buy an EV vehicle.
Good point.
Is there any risk that if you push this to a point where it may induce like excess private parking being developed in sites?
I think there's potentially that risk. I think the way to approach that problem, or to kind of cut that off at the head, would be to take a look at zoning requirements around parking minimums and that kind of, which we talked about a little bit earlier. But if you did both of those moves, then you'd be able to kind of stop that incentive from kind of running amok.
So I guess if we're going to talk about parking generally, back to the question about just reducing parking minimum. So in the Transdorian development, if that is the one thing that you do, is you just start reducing parking minimums, do we have evidence to show that vehicle miles drop? And then, yeah, so Does that exist? Has anyone looked at that?
Yes. Yeah, that's we do have research on that one, and we do see positive effects from a climate standpoint that does help bring bring VMTs down, and as a result, see a reduction in CO2 emissions.
All right, Matt, walk me through that. So we reduce our density in our parking spaces, parking requirements. Um, people will, is the concern that people will get ticked off? And I mean, if you don't combine it with some kind of infrastructure that allows for non-car movement, what you do is you force people to start hunting for parking spaces, or they just go somewhere else and decide that's just too much trouble. So do you have to, is it smart to link those with those two together? So you have to have both simultaneously, or else you create unwanted problems in one area trying to solve a different issue?
I think that's where having some of the increased access to transit and bike and ped modes becomes more important, is to make sure that you don't create that, because you're going to get that pushback regardless. I mean, like the retail community is going to say this is terrible for us. But if it's still actually, you're just creating a different means for people to get to those stores that's going to come through transit, biking, pedestrian activity, then you can alleviate most of the real impact that way. The
So
kind
for
of negative.
example,
Oh, go ahead. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, for example, in downtown of Athens, if we had a transit system that had a trolley that went through on a regular basis through downtown, and people had to park outside or in a deck outside that area, um, then those things linking together would be a way to approach it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I was just going to say the kind of the big difference between the buildings and the power sector stuff and the transportation stuff. Uh, Most of the research on buildings and power is like today we can find a lot of win-win solutions where you basically get to do what you're doing right now and it's cheaper and cleaner and you have those kinds of benefits. And the transportation side, a lot of it is trying to figure out how to change people to do something that they're not doing right now. So there's a shift, and a lot of that is trying to figure out how to make it less convenient to do what they're doing today. So either give them a reason to do something different. Well, it is just give them a reason to do something different, whether it's, a positive reason or negative reason is kind of the push and pull.
And I think largely in the downtown zoning, Athens only has parking requirements for residential components. Like none of the commercial components require parking downtown currently.
Okay,
I
the
think we were
next item, Matt.
Yeah, I was heading towards congestion pricing. This one may be a bit exotic, but we'll see see how we go. This has been deployed in a small number of cities and only one in the US so far. Actually, that one hasn't finished its full implementation. They're still in process. Um, but what this is like, the economists love this option because you create a charge for driving into cities at certain times of day. So if it's, during rush hour, you can use prices to manage traffic demand. So it applies a surcharge on motor vehicle drivers during peak times to try to encourage alternative mobility choices or choosing a different time to make the travel choice.
How do you
Uh,
implement this?
yeah, so that's been done through, today, it's mostly done electronically. So there's plate readers, things kind of like if you've used Peach Pass or something like that to be able to like drive on toll roads in Georgia. It's that same kind of process where there's a scan of your plate or a scan of a sticker. That gives you, that lets them know that you've entered into this zone or you're leaving the
So
zone.
every driver coming in has to have that sticker?
They do, or there's, for some of the bigger deployed, I mean, I don't want to say like bigger because they're all big. The ones who have deployed this are London, Stockholm, Singapore, and now New York City's in process. So this is kind of what I mean by like big players, not much US experience with this. Uh, so I don't know how deep we really want to go, but that is,
Yeah.
they do a read, they'll identify, there's like a plate check component to it that will be submitted. Um, and there's a charge, either you either have an account or there's a charge that's issued for entering the congestion zone at the time that that's occurring. The the flag I had in my notes on this one, I mean, this obviously hasn't been widely deployed in the US, but it does have large appeal to economists and kind of the technocratic elite. If you're preparing to get attacked, those buzzwords are going to come in your ears. We did see that about a $5 congestion price spurs a 1% reduction in travel demand, like period. All passenger miles traveled, transit, bike, single occupancy, you name it, like there's that reduction. And then there was a 7% increase in ridership. So this would be a way that you did see an effect of more carpooling. This was passengers per vehicle across all modes. But the biggest barrier to it becoming highly effective as a climate solution is the geographic limitations. So most cities, even though the small handful that have done this, they make the area that's subject to the pricing pretty small. So like with New York, they're talking about like a radius of 1 mile around the area that they want to apply this kind of pricing to. So it's like, as a transportation management policy, it might be fairly effective for them. As a CO2 reduction strategy, it's still going to be pretty minor. And then you've had huge pushback in the US for the cities where this has been proposed. San Francisco, just to pick another, highly progressive context, has been trying to put this in place for about 12 years and still hasn't succeeded in getting it through. And New York took them about a decade to get it in place. So beyond that, there's also significant equity concerns that require careful consideration. As part of the reason New York's has been so slow to roll out is that they're trying to step through that pretty intentionally. So that one's pretty challenging policy to get up and running. That might be one of those where we can say we talked about it, but we're probably not going in that direction. Don't let me speak for you. I'm not trying to say like that's what your answer should be, but I just that's my sense of where that may land.
No, you kind of answered it. We can move to the next one.
Electrify fleets and buses.
All right, so this is one where we know Athens has got a little bit of a jump on most of the rest of the country here. You're starting to see a lot more action towards transit vehicle electrification as those authorities are seeing the fuel and the maintenance cost savings. So generally the vehicles are more expensive up front, and that's expected to be the case for quite some time, but those vehicles may be in service for a decade or more. So there's a strong opportunity to make the money back and then some in this one. Full transition could take another 10 to 15 years if governments don't retire vehicles ahead of schedule, but we're definitely seeing that happen. Major challenges, that upfront cost, although the Department of Transportation does provide grants and investments in transit vehicles that bring those costs down. quite a bit.
Are there any particular benefits to identify for specifically converting school buses to electric?
I'm thinking of it on the other side of that. Like, would you be able to identify something like a reduction in childhood asthma? So if I'm not going the right way there, Michael, let me
Yeah,
know.
I
But
mean, I
that's,
think I was thinking of health benefits and places where school buses drive and who's impacted by diesel fumes. I mean, not to, I mean, in addition to the cost savings that may go to the school district.
yes. So there are benefits. We've been able to quantify the health benefits for a few cities, including Denver, that was specifically focused on their school district with them. So there are ways to piece some of that together. I think it's still more correlation driven than being able to like take this to a court of law and being able to say we have causality for it. So I don't want to overstate the result that you see, but we do see reductions in things like asthma or just other respiratory illness as a result of more vehicle electrification in the bus system.
One of the things that might be helpful too that I'm having trouble myself finding is information related to the maintenance cost difference between buses, electric versus gas and or diesel, and then car versus same thing, electric vehicle. You know, being able to tell people the first 100,000 miles, you basically are going to change oil and not change oil, you're going to rotate tires and change filters. And that's a huge difference. But kind of when you think of batteries, cost of batteries, any of that helps us understand an annual cost over a period of time, and to be able to compare that would be great.
Yeah. So I think we have some of that data, and some of the other partners on the team, like CTE, I think are likely to have that as well. They may have more real world, like we tend to get broad survey, what's your average usual expectation? They may have some very specific examples to bring
Well,
forward.
given I have a presentation on Thursday night, it would be helpful to have that more solid than I have at this point. Thank you.
All right, we've got about 11 minutes left, which I think will get us through the last of these items. So the next one up, yeah, freeze that roof, Matt. The next one up is ubiquitous EV charging infrastructure.
Yeah, so this goes right to one of the earlier questions. So the idea here is trying to get more charging stations deployed across the city to promote the adoption of electric vehicles. You see a combination of government and utilities pushing this forward. So there's kind of different considerations with each. So we can talk about that a little. But the broad research on this front is showing that this kind of goes back to that elasticity relationship thought. So for a 1% increase in charging stations, you see a 3% increase in EV ownership. So what that's telling us is that getting more of that EV charging infrastructure out there can really accelerate EV adoption right now in the US population. That's the good news.
And so I'm not questioning that, but in those studies, is there a very good separation between which one's the cause and which one's the effect? Because it seems like if you have more electric vehicles driving around, more charging infrastructure is going to pop up because of the need for it. So that just wondering.
Yeah, that one they've done a pretty good job of controlling in those studies to be able to isolate that effect. I think there's reason to doubt that it's kind of like the bike lane finding. Like there's reason to doubt that it's sustainable in the long run because we're at such a low base today. people seeing another 1% increase in chargers, you might not be able to increase by 1%. Like you put another one out and that's a 25% increase in the charging infrastructure available across the city, right? And so and that might induce 10 new electric vehicles across the community. Like that may not, you're not seeing huge numbers necessarily yet. But as that gets higher and higher, I think we're going to get, we'll see it slow down some.
I mean, my thinking on this generally is that like people who have houses are going to charge their vehicles at home. I mean, that's one of the great conveniences is that you don't have to go to the gas station anymore. It's like free shipping for gas right to your garage. But the challenge will be people who don't live in homes and live in apartment complexes, and having the capacity for them to be able to charge is, I think, a hurdle that really will open it up to the possibility of anybody owning one.
Yeah, and actually this is one that Megan can probably speak really well to, because you've got a number of municipalities that have put in place EV charging mandates, especially for like multifamily properties where they do have a requirement now. If you're building one, they'll either have like EV ready where they have to build the conduit, or they actually require the installation of the chargers. So Megan, I know you went through that, like the actual process of getting that kind of legislation passed. If you want to speak to it.
Yeah, in the state of Georgia, the process is twofold. It involves a local ordinance as well as going through DCA to essentially notify DCA of your intention to do that and provide an opportunity for them to advise against it. So far, so good. In the city of Atlanta's case, they decide there are a few different pathways within codes of ordinances you could go about this. You could do it through your basic building code or land development code. In the case of the city of Atlanta, they folded it within the amendments to their electrical code and set it up so that there was a 20% requirement of all spaces in commercial and multifamily parking decks as well as lots be in new construction, essentially have the conduit set up, so be EV charging ready. Other jurisdictions now are looking to just require the infrastructure be built in as well. Might as well get it out of the way, but at least by building the EV readiness, that makes it less onerous for a building owner to install that infrastructure at a later date if you've already got things set up for it. But I'm trying to think of examples that have just gone ahead and required the actual infrastructure, but I think maybe San Francisco, we could look that up pretty easily.
Yeah.
I would
Go ahead, Mike.
I was just saying, I'd be particularly interested in ones where, custom to Michael's point of stopping in a gas station and multi-family. It seems like if they're level 3 chargers in a gas station, then where you're going to go get a drink and go to the bathroom, all that kind of stuff. So the question is there a public-private partnership that y'all have seen that's been where they've done that? And can you send us some examples of how they set that up?
Yeah, the big ones that we've seen. This is kind of thank you for the segue, Mike. To come back to the utility versus public, purely public side of it. We've seen examples where government just tried to take the lead or did stuff like what you had with Atlanta. When the focus was on really deploying the charging infrastructure, you've seen more. So like the biggest recent example I've got is St. Paul, Minnesota, got money out of the Department of Transportation, out of the US DOT, to just directly fund the installation. So like they were able to just go do it themselves. In North Carolina, you've got Duke Energy that's trying to take a lead in deploying that infrastructure. And so they're trying to partner with local governments as well as local businesses to get that infrastructure out there.
Just trying to figure out how to get a local government in a private business, because there are problems with trying to do that So how did they overcome the legal hurdles associated with essentially having a government sponsored or built facility on a private piece of property?
Well, and that's the part where you see the utilities, especially the big ones, have a little harder time because there are third-party businesses, for-profit businesses out here trying to get charging infrastructure deployed. Like that's their own business. And when the investor-owned utilities do it, they're adding it to a rate base and getting a guaranteed profit that's approved by their public service commissions. Goes through that whole regulatory process for them. So that's a very active area of debate at the state levels. Is how much should the big incumbent utilities be allowed to play in that space? I think the local governments and the utilities themselves find themselves very aligned on wanting to get that infrastructure out. I guess I'm just saying there are successful examples of how to do that, but you just have to expect some limitations if like a Georgia Power is going to be the one that does it. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw the Public Service Commission say, you're allowed to deploy some of these, but you may have, like 2,000 is your limit statewide. You can't put more than that out.
Okay.
And then we've got 2 more minutes. So let's quickly go through the electric vehicle battery reuse.
Yeah, so this is more theoretical at this point than something that's been deployed. There's a lot of discussion that you have EV batteries that are going to be good for somewhere between 7 and 10 years before they need to get swapped out. And most electric vehicles haven't been on the road that long, so we don't really have this as a opportunity yet. But there's a discussion of trying to collect those batteries when they need to be replaced, and to create a battery bank. So basically just connect them all together and have them provide grid services. So the same way that you would buy battery storage at the grid scale, you could buy used EV batteries and create the same kind of energy system from that. And the main argument for that is that the batteries, when they're taken out of the electric vehicles, still have about 70% of their energy storage capability. So there's still a lot of function that's left to them, but they're just not as reliable for somebody that was going to want to jump in their car and know that they could go 40, 50 miles. They might have concerns about doing that, but you could still use it for grid services.
All right. Great timing. So we've got 1 more of these scheduled for the 22nd from 1 to 2:30 p.m. I believe invites have been sent out for that, and we'll also see most, if not all of you tomorrow during the September Community Advisory Board meeting at 2 o'clock. So with that, I think we can let you go unless Mike wanted to wrap us up with any additional information.
Just a thank you for everybody for coming and for input. And if you have additional questions or would like some additional resources, just pass that information on and we'll do our best to gather it up and get that back out to everybody. So thank you everybody for being here today.
Thanks. Bye.